For 15 years, my parents credited my brother with building our family's multi-million-dollar construction company while I silently managed its operations from the shadows. They hung his photo in the lobby, introduced him as the architect of our success at industry events, and even named the company after him. Then the audit happened, and suddenly those company records I'd meticulously maintained revealed the uncomfortable truth. I had personally secured 83% of our client contracts, designed our proprietary project management system, and reinvested my own bonuses to fund our expansion. The company my brother supposedly built had my fingerprints all over it, and now everyone knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Olivia Chambers, and for the past 12 years, I've been the Chief Operations Officer at Chambers Construction Group. Our company specializes in commercial renovations and historic building restorations across New England, with a portfolio that includes everything from century-old libraries to modern corporate headquarters. While many executives in my position might delegate the daily challenges to their teams, I've always preferred a hands-on approach. There's something deeply satisfying about transforming architectural plans into tangible structures, about witnessing a building's rebirth from deterioration to distinction. Chambers Construction wasn't always the industry leader it is today. When I joined the company fresh out of graduate school with my master's in structural engineering and MBA, we were a modest family operation with 8 employees working out of my parents' converted garage. My father, Richard Chambers, had founded the business 30 years earlier as a residential contractor, and my mother, Catherine, handled the bookkeeping between raising 3 children. My older brother, James, had joined right after high school, learning the practical aspects of construction while I pursued my education. My condominium in downtown Boston isn't extravagant, but it's a testament to my personal design philosophy: clean lines, functional spaces, and strategic splurges on elements that matter. From my 12th floor balcony, I can see the harbor where ships come and go, their lights twinkling against the evening sky. On clear nights like tonight, the view offers a moment of serenity that contrasts sharply with the controlled chaos of construction management. I was reviewing contract specifications for the Westfield Public Library restoration, our largest project to date, when my phone vibrated with a familiar notification. My father's weekly update email had arrived, earlier than usual. Typically, these messages contained performance metrics and board meeting notes, but something about the subject line, "Urgent Annual Industry Awards Gala," suggested this wasn't routine business. The message was brief. Olivia, the New England Builders Association has selected Chambers Construction for their Legacy Achievement Award. The gala is next Friday at the Harborview Hotel. James will be accepting on behalf of the company, but your mother and I expect your attendance. Formal attire required. I stared at the screen, a familiar disappointment settling in my chest. The Legacy Achievement Award was the industry's highest honor, recognizing excellence in construction, innovation, business ethics, and community impact. It was validation of everything I'd worked for over the past decade: the sustainable construction initiatives I'd implemented, the apprenticeship program for disadvantaged youth I'd established, the proprietary project management software I'd developed that had cut our completion times by 22%. And James would be accepting it. I set my phone down and walked to the balcony, watching the harbor lights blur as I blinked back frustration. This was nothing new. Since I'd joined the company, James had been the face of Chambers Construction, while I managed its heart. At client presentations, industry events, and media interviews, my brother stood front and center with his charismatic smile and rehearsed talking points, while I remained in the background, ensuring the promises he made became reality. It wasn't that James was incompetent. He had genuine talent for networking and client relations, but the narrative my parents had constructed, that James was the visionary behind our company's transformation from local contractor to regional, powerhouse, was a fiction that had solidified into accepted fact over the years. The reality was considerably more complex. When I joined Chambers Construction, the company was struggling to compete in an increasingly sophisticated market. My father's traditional approach had served us well in residential construction, but commercial projects required technical expertise and management systems he hadn't developed. James had good instincts, but lacked the educational background and analytical mindset needed for strategic growth. I had returned home with ambitious plans and modern methodologies, expecting to partner with my family to elevate the business. Instead, I found myself in an unspoken hierarchy where my brother's ideas, often variations of concepts I had introduced during family dinners, received enthusiastic support, while my direct proposals faced skepticism and resistance. Rather than fighting this dynamic, I had channeled my energy into actionable improvements. I overhauled our bidding process, implemented digital project management, established sustainability standards that became our competitive advantage, and personally secured relationships with architects and developers who appreciated speaking directly with an engineer rather than a salesperson. The results spoke for themselves. Within 3 years of my joining, our annual revenue had tripled. Within 5 years, we had expanded from local renovations to landmark restorations across 3 states. Within 8 years, we had opened a second office and grown to 65 employees. And throughout this transformation, my parents consistently attributed our success to James's leadership and James's vision. In family businesses, I had learned emotions and history often outweigh objective performance. My parents saw in James a reflection of my father's practical, self-made journey. In me, perhaps they saw something that made them uncomfortable, a reminder that the future of construction belonged to those with technical education and innovative approaches, rather than those who had learned exclusively through apprenticeship. I had made peace with this reality, finding satisfaction in the tangible results of my work rather than the public recognition. But the Legacy Achievement Award felt different. It specifically honored the innovations and ethical practices I had personally championed, often against resistance from my own family. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my younger sister, Megan, the only family member who fully understood my position. 3 years my junior, she had established her own architecture firm in Chicago, deliberately separate from the family business. "Let me guess," she said when I answered. "Dad's making James accept the award that should rightfully be yours, and you're out on your balcony doing your stoic contemplation thing." I laughed despite myself. "Am I that predictable?" "Only to someone who grew up watching this pattern," she replied. "Remember when your sustainable construction proposal won that grant money, and somehow Dad's press release made it sound like it was James's initiative that you were just implementing? Or when Boston Business Journal wanted to interview the person behind our digital transformation, and they sent James instead of me?" I added, the memories rising to the surface. "Are you going to the gala?" Megan asked. I sighed, watching a ferry cross the harbor below. "Of course I am. It's still our company's achievement, even if the narrative is skewed." "One day," Megan said thoughtfully, "the truth is going to come out. You can only maintain a fiction for so long before reality asserts itself." I didn't know then how prophetic her words would prove to be. The week leading up to the awards, gala passed in a flurry of project deadlines and client meetings. The Westfield Public Library restoration was entering its most critical phase, with structural reinforcements being installed in the century-old reading room. I spent long days on site, collaborating with the preservation specialist and engineering team to solve unexpected challenges revealed during the initial demolition. These were the moments I loved most, standing in a partially deconstructed historic building, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light through scaffolding, making real-time decisions that balanced structural integrity with historical authenticity. In these spaces, my expertise was unquestioned. Contractors and craftspeople looked to me for guidance, not to James or my father. By Friday evening, I had barely had time to return to my condominium and prepare for the gala. I selected a tailored black dress with architectural details along the neckline, subtle, professional, but with the attention to detail that characterized my approach to everything. As I fastened my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I typically wore to industry functions, I reminded myself that tonight was about celebrating Chambers Construction's achievement, not dwelling on family dynamics. The Harborview Hotel ballroom was transformed for the occasion, with scale models of iconic New England buildings serving as centerpieces and architectural blueprints projected as light patterns across the ceiling. Industry leaders, client representatives, and government officials mingled over cocktails as I entered, scanning the room for familiar faces. I spotted my parents immediately. My father, distinguished in his tuxedo with silver hair that matched his cufflinks, was deep in conversation with the president of the Builders Association. My mother, elegant in navy blue, stood attentively at his side. James was working the mall room with practiced ease, moving from group to group with the confident handshakes and ready laughter that had become his professional signature. "Olivia!" My mother noticed me first, waving me over. "There you are." We were beginning to think, "You might miss the ceremony." "The Westfield structural reinforcement hit a complication," I explained. I needed to ensure the solution was properly documented before I could leave the site. My father frowned slightly. "You have project managers for that sort of thing. Tonight is important for the company's image." Before I could respond, James joined our circle, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "The woman of the hour finally arrives. I was just telling Senator Wilson about your obsessive attention to detail." I said, "That's my sister. She probably can't even see this ballroom without mentally calculating load-bearing requirements for the chandeliers." He laughed, and my parents joined in. I forced a smile. "Someone has to make sure the buildings we celebrate tonight remain standing, James." A server passed with champagne, and I gratefully accepted a glass, needing something to occupy my hands. As the organization's president approached the podium and the crowd began moving toward their assigned tables, I noticed an unfamiliar man watching our family interaction with unusual interest. He wore a well-tailored suit and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to announce his importance. "Who is that?" I asked my mother as we moved toward the Chambers construction table near the front. She followed my gaze. "Marcus Harrington, the new regional director for the Department of Building Inspection. Your father mentioned he's implementing some sort of regulatory modernization initiative." She lowered her voice. "Very influential for future contracts. James should make a point of speaking with him after the ceremony." Of course, another networking opportunity for James, despite the fact that I was the one who managed our regulatory compliance and permitting processes. As we took our seats, I found myself placed between a client's representative and Marcus Harrington himself, who nodded politely as he settled into his chair. "Olivia Chambers," I introduced myself, extending my hand. "Marcus Harrington," he replied with a firm handshake. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your sustainable retrofit specifications for historic buildings are quite remarkable. I've been using them as a reference point for our updated regulatory guidelines." I blinked in surprise. "You're familiar with our specifications?" "I've read all your white papers and case studies," he said. "Your integration of preservation standards with modern energy efficiency requirements is the most innovative approach I've seen in the industry. I'm particularly impressed with the methodology you developed for the Richardson building renovation." For a moment, I was speechless. The Richardson specifications had been published in a trade journal under the company name, not my personal byline. Few people outside our immediate team knew I had authored them. "How did you know I developed those?" I asked. A slight smile crossed his face. "I make it my business to know who's actually doing the work, Ms. Chambers, especially when that work is reshaping best practices in our industry." Before I could respond, The lights dimmed and the awards ceremony began. As various companies received recognition for safety records, community engagement, and project excellence, I found myself unusually distracted by Harrington's comment. What else did he know about the actual operations of Chambers Construction? And why was he interested? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Legacy Achievement Award was the final presentation of the evening. As the Builders Association president described the selection criteria, innovation in construction methodologies, business ethics that exceeded industry, standards and measurable community impact, I felt an uncomfortable tightness in my chest. Every achievement she enumerated had been my initiative, my design, my implementation. The sustainable construction program that had reduced our carbon footprint by 43% while maintaining historical integrity. The apprenticeship pathway that had brought 63 disadvantaged youth into construction careers. The digital management platform that had become a case study at 3 university business schools. It is my great pleasure, the president concluded, to present this year's Legacy Achievement Award to Chambers Construction Group, a company that exemplifies how family tradition can evolve to meet contemporary challenges while maintaining core values of craftsmanship and integrity. Applause filled the ballroom as my father rose from his seat, motioning for James to join him on stage. I clapped mechanically, watching as they accepted the crystal trophy with identical broad smiles. My father stepped to the microphone first. "This recognition means everything to our family," he began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had directed construction sites for 3 decades. When I started Chambers Construction from the back of my pickup truck, I never imagined we'd be standing here today. But I always believed in building things to last, whether it's a structure, a business, or a legacy. He turned to James with unmistakable pride. That's why it gives me such satisfaction to see the company flourishing under the next generation's leadership. My son James has transformed what was once a modest local operation into the regional leader we are today. His vision, his determination, and his innovative approaches have elevated Chambers Construction beyond anything I could have imagined. James stepped forward, accepting both the trophy and the mantle of achievement with practiced humility. "Thank you, Dad, and thank you to the association. This award belongs to every member of the Chambers Construction team, from our skilled craftspeople to our dedicated project managers." His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly at our table. "I'd like to particularly acknowledge our family, my mother, Catherine, who kept the books balanced when we couldn't afford an accountant, my sister, Megan, whose architectural insights inform our approach to design integration." He hesitated almost imperceptibly. "And my sister, Olivia, whose operational support ensures our projects run smoothly." Operational support. That was how he characterized my comprehensive overhaul of the company's entire business model. My personal securing of our most significant clients, my development of the proprietary methodologies that had become industry standards. I maintained my professional smile, even as I felt Marcus Harrington's evaluating gaze on me. The remaining minutes of James's acceptance speech blurred as I focused on maintaining my composure, applauding at appropriate intervals until they returned to the table with the trophy, which my father placed directly in front of James's seat. "Congratulations," Harrington said, as the formal program concluded and conversation resumed around the table. "That's quite an achievement for your family." "Thank you," I replied automatically. "The company has come a long way." "Indeed. It's remarkable how much has changed since you joined the firm." His emphasis was subtle, but unmistakable. "I reviewed some of your regulatory filings while preparing for tonight. Your signature appears on virtually every significant innovation the company has implemented over the past decade." I glanced around to ensure no one was listening closely. "We operate as a team. My role simply includes more administrative responsibilities." Harrington raised an eyebrow. Is that what you call establishing an entirely new approach to sustainable historic renovation, administrative responsibilities? Before I could formulate a response that balanced honesty with family loyalty, my father appeared beside us, extending his hand to Harrington. Richard Chambers, he introduced himself. I understand you're revolutionizing the inspection and permitting processes. We should discuss how Chambers construction can align with your new initiatives. I'd welcome that conversation, Harrington replied, standing to shake my father's hand. In fact, I was just discussing with Olivia her innovative approach to regulatory compliance integration. Her pre-submission methodology has reduced approval timelines by nearly 40% on complex projects. It's exactly the kind of efficiency we're trying to encourage. My father's expression flickered between surprise and discomfort. Olivia handles many of our administrative processes, he acknowledged stiffly. But James oversees our regulatory strategy. You should really speak with him about any substantive initiatives. Harrington's gaze shifted between us. I see. Well, I'd be interested in speaking with whoever developed your current compliance framework. It's quite impressive. That would be me, I said quietly but firmly. I designed our regulatory approach after completing my master's research on adaptive compliance for historic structures. My father frowned. Olivia implements our procedures very effectively, but the strategic direction comes from our executive leadership. He gestured toward James, who was entertaining a group of clients across the room. My son has transformed how we approach every aspect of the business. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, Harrington inquiring about specific technical innovations, my father redirecting credit to James, and me attempting to navigate the narrow path between claiming my work and contradicting my father publicly. Eventually, Harrington excused himself, but not before handing me his business card. I'd appreciate a more detailed conversation about your regulatory framework, he said. Perhaps at your office next week? I'm particularly interested in reviewing your documentation process. After he departed, my father turned to me with undisguised irritation. What exactly did you say to him before I arrived? He seemed to have some misunderstandings about our organizational structure. I didn't misrepresent anything, I replied evenly. He was familiar with my white papers and regulatory submissions. Those documents have my signature because I developed the frameworks they describe. You developed them under James's direction. As part of the team he leads, my father corrected. This is exactly why we need to be careful about how we present ourselves at these functions. Clients and regulators need to see a clear chain of command, not confusion about who's responsible for what. The familiar frustration bubbled up inside. Me. There's nothing confusing about acknowledging who actually created the work that won us this award tonight. The award is for the company, Olivia, not for individual contributions. His tone carried the finality that had ended countless childhood disagreements. Now, there are several potential clients James wants you to meet. Try to be more precise about your role when you speak with them. As he walked away, I remained at the table, fingering the edge of Harrington's business card. My role. The phrase echoed in my mind, laden with a decade of similar corrections and redirections. In my parents' narrative, James was the visionary leader, while I was the dutiful daughter who handled details and implementation. The fact that I had conceived, designed, and executed the company's most significant innovations was inconvenient to this story, so it was simply revised away. I had accepted this dynamic for years, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than the recognition. But something about tonight, perhaps the scale of the award, perhaps Harrington's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of my contributions, perhaps simply the accumulation of 1,000 similar slights, had crystallized my dissatisfaction in a way I could no longer ignore. The remainder of the evening passed in a fog of professional networking. I smiled and shook hands, described project specifications and timelines, and deflected questions about our award-winning innovations to James with practiced grace. By the time I returned to my condominium shortly after midnight, exhaustion had settled into my bones. I kicked off my heels in the entryway and moved to the balcony, the night air cool against my skin. Boston Harbor stretched before me, the water a canvas of reflected lights from the city skyline. In the distance, a cargo ship moved slowly toward the horizon, its running lights marking a deliberate path forward. My phone buzzed with a text message from Megan. "How bad was it? Scale of 1-10, with 10 being, I'm quitting to start a rival company tomorrow." I smiled despite myself. 7-5, I typed back. Dad practically introduced me as James's administrative assistant to the new regulatory director. "Typical," came her quick reply. "Want me to fly in and create a scene at Sunday dinner?" I've been practicing my outraged younger sister monologue. Tempting, but unnecessary. Besides, you know Mom would just redirect the conversation to your lack of a serious boyfriend. True. The curse of being Chambers women, accomplishments invisible, personal lives under microscope. Did the trophy at least acknowledge the company rather than just James? I considered the ornate crystal award with Chambers Construction Group engraved on its face. Company name on trophy, but Dad's speech credited our transformation entirely to James's vision and leadership. There was a longer pause before her response arrived. "One day you're going to have to decide if you want the credit or just the work. You can't complain about something you actively enable, Liv." Her words stung with their accuracy. For years, I had told myself that my silence was professional, that publicly contradicting the family narrative would damage the company, that my work would eventually speak for itself. But the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. I was afraid. Afraid of the conflict that would erupt if I directly challenged my parents' favoritism. Afraid of fracturing family relationships beyond repair. Afraid, perhaps most fundamentally, of discovering that even with irrefutable evidence of my contributions, they would still place James's status above my accomplishments. I didn't respond to Megan's text. Instead, I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder I hadn't accessed in months. Inside were preliminary plans for a potential venture of my own, a specialized consultancy focusing on sustainable historic renovations, the niche I had created at Chambers that had generated our most profitable and acclaimed projects. I had sketched out business models, identified potential clients, even drafted a mission statement. But each time I had seriously considered striking out on my own, something had held me back. Sometimes it was a challenging project that engaged my creativity. Sometimes it was a sense of obligation to the employees I had hired and mentored. Most often, though, it was the nagging hope that eventually my parents would see me, truly see me and my contributions, and finally grant me the recognition I had earned. Tonight had confirmed how unlikely that scenario was. Despite overseeing every aspect of the work that had won us our industry's highest honor, I had been relegated to a supporting role in the narrative. Operational support was how James had characterized my decade of innovation and leadership. I closed the laptop without making any decisions. Tomorrow would bring project deadlines and client meetings, demanding the focused attention that had made me effective regardless of recognition. But Megan's challenge lingered in my mind as I prepared for bed. You can't complain about something you actively enable. She was right, of course. By remaining silent when my work was attributed to James, by accepting my father's corrections about my role, by continuing to pour my creativity and expertise into a company that refused to acknowledge my contributions, I was participating in my own erasure. The question was, what was I prepared to do about it? Sunday dinner at my parents' suburban home had been a monthly tradition since I returned from graduate school. The sprawling colonial-style house with its manicured lawn and professional landscaping was a testament to Chambers Construction's success, and, ironically, largely paid for by projects I had secured and managed over the past decade. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed James's luxury SUV already parked near the entrance. He had likely arrived early to discuss business with our father, a standing pre-dinner meeting from which I was habitually excluded despite my senior position in the company. The familiar pang of exclusion had dulled over years, but Harrington's pointed observations at the gala had reopened the wound. My mother greeted me at the door, accepting the bottle of wine I offered with a practiced hostess smile. "Just in time," she said, ushering me into the formal living room where James and my father were already seated with drinks. "We were just discussing the Anderson Tower contract." "The Anderson project?" I echoed in surprise. I wasn't aware we were bidding on that. The Anderson Tower was a prestigious downtown renovation, exactly the type of high-profile historic preservation work I typically handled personally. James swirled the scotch in his glass. "Just preliminary discussions. Roger Anderson approached me at the gala Friday. He was impressed by the award." "I've created a preliminary strategy," my father added. "James will take the lead on this. 1. It could be our largest contract to date." I carefully controlled my expression as I accepted the glass of wine my mother offered. The Anderson Tower was precisely the type of project I had built my reputation on. A historically significant structure requiring sophisticated engineering solutions and navigating complex preservation requirements. If anyone at Chambers Construction should be leading that bid, it was me. "The Anderson building has significant structural challenges," I noted, keeping my tone informational rather than challenging. "The foundation requires specialized reinforcement techniques we developed for the Westfield Library. I'd be happy to prepare the technical aspects of the proposal." My father waved a dismissive hand. "James can handle the client relationship. You can assist with the technical documentation once we've secured the contract." Assist, there it was again, the reflexive diminishment of my role to supporting James, regardless of where the relevant expertise actually resided. I took a slow sip of my wine, buying time to compose my response. "Actually," I said carefully, "I already have a relationship with Roger Anderson. I consulted on his Cambridge project last year when they encountered preservation compliance issues. He specifically asked about our approach to historic structural reinforcement at the Massachusetts Historical Society event in March." James frowned slightly. "You never mentioned that." "I include all client interactions in my monthly reports," I replied evenly. "The Cambridge consultation is documented in the March overview." My father set his glass down with a definitive click. "Regardless, James will handle the Anderson proposal. We need to present a consistent leadership image, especially after the publicity from the award. You can certainly contribute your technical expertise to support his presentation." The conversation shifted to other topics as my mother announced dinner was ready. Throughout the perfectly prepared meal, my mother's roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, a family tradition, I found myself increasingly distant from the conversation around me. James dominated the discussion with anecdotes from the gala, emphasizing connections he had made and potential opportunities he was exploring. My parents received these stories with approving nods and encouraging questions. When the conversation eventually turned to me, it focused exclusively on my personal life rather than professional accomplishments. Had I met anyone interesting recently? Was I still working such long hours? Perhaps I should join the country club where my mother played tennis. She knew several eligible professionals in their 30s who might be good matches. By the time dessert was served, a decision had crystallized in my mind. I would accept Marcus Harrington's invitation to discuss our regulatory compliance framework, and I would ensure the documentation he reviewed accurately reflected who had developed the systems and processes that had earned Chambers Construction its stellar reputation. It wasn't about ego or credit. It was about truth. And perhaps, after all these years, it was time for the truth to emerge from the shadows. The Chambers Construction headquarters occupied 3 floors of a brick warehouse we had renovated in Boston's Seaport District. The transformation of the century-old maritime storage facility into a sleek, energy-efficient office space had been my first major project after joining the company. I had personally designed the adaptive reuse strategy that preserved the building's industrial character, while creating a showcase for sustainable renovation techniques. Ironically, the building itself stood as physical evidence of the disconnect between contribution and credit in our family business. The architectural magazines that had featured the renovation attributed its innovative design to James Chambers and the Chambers construction team. The bronze plaque in the lobby described it as reimagined by James Chambers 2011. Even the case study we provided to potential clients identified James as the project lead, despite the fact that he had been minimally involved beyond client socializing and publicity appearances. I arrived at the office early Monday morning, a full 2 hours before my scheduled meeting with Marcus Harrington. The regulatory documentation he wanted to review was extensive, spanning nearly a decade of methodologies I had developed and refined. While digital copies existed in our project management system, I wanted to gather the original drafts and development materials that clearly showed my ideation process and implementation strategy. My executive office occupied the northeast corner of the second floor, with windows overlooking both the harbor and the city skyline. Unlike the showpiece corner office James rarely used, with its expensive artwork and design magazine styling, my workspace was functional and efficient. Project timelines covered one wall, technical reference materials filled the bookshelves, and detailed models of our most challenging structural solutions occupied a dedicated work table. I began assembling the relevant materials for Harrington's review. The initial framework I had developed during graduate school, the implementation plan I had created when joining the company, the iterative improvements documented through successive projects, the training materials I had written for our project managers. Each document, spreadsheet, and presentation deck contained clear evidence of my authorship, my digital signatures, my revision notes, my distinctive analytical approach. As I organized these materials, a notification appeared on my computer, a calendar reminder for the weekly executive meeting that would begin in 30 minutes. Normally, these meetings followed a predictable pattern. My father would preside. James would present client development updates with characteristic charisma, and I would provide operational briefings that were often rushed through in the remaining time. Today, however, with the Legacy Award still fresh and the Anderson Tower bid in development, I anticipated the dynamic would be even more imbalanced than usual. I considered skipping the meeting to continue preparing for Harrington, but that would only reinforce the narrative that operations, my domain, were secondary to the real business of client relationships and publicity that James handled. The executive conference room occupied the top floor, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the harbor. As I expected, my father and James were already seated at the head of the table, reviewing documents and speaking in the lowered voices that signaled private discussion. Our CFO, Thomas Wilson, sat across from them, organizing financial reports. The remaining chairs were filled by our marketing director, human resources manager, and lead project manager, all technically my direct reports, though the reporting structure was frequently circumvented by my father and brother. I took my seat midway down the table, placing my tablet and notebook precisely at right angles. This small ritual of organization had become a centering technique over years of meetings, where my contributions were minimized or overlooked. Now that we're all here, my father began with a pointed glance at his watch, despite my being 5 minutes early. Let's get started. James, update us on client development following the award ceremony. James leaned forward with the eager energy that made him effective with clients. The response has been tremendous. We've received congratulatory calls from every major developer in New England. More importantly, we've secured preliminary meetings for 3 major projects. He paused for effect, including the Anderson Tower renovation. Murmurs of approval circulated around the table. The Anderson project was indeed a significant opportunity, a 28-story historic building requiring comprehensive modernization, while maintaining its landmark status. It was exactly the type of complex, high-profile project I specialized in, combining preservation requirements with innovative engineering solutions. Roger Anderson and I really connected at the gala, James continued. He was impressed by our sustainable renovation approach. I've scheduled a presentation for next week to outline our vision for the tower. I maintained my professional expression, though the misrepresentation was galling. Roger Anderson's interest in our company stemmed directly from the technical consultation I had provided for his Cambridge project, a fact documented in my client reports, but apparently ignored in executive discussions. The Anderson project could be our largest contract to date, my father added with obvious pride. James will lead the proposal team, with support from operations as needed. The familiar phrasing, James leading, operations supporting, triggered something unexpected within me. Perhaps it was the accumulation of similar instances over the years. Perhaps it was Harrington's forthright acknowledgement of my work contrasting so sharply with my family's dismissal. Whatever the catalyst, I found myself speaking before fully forming the thought. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through the congratulatory atmosphere. Roger Anderson specifically sought out our company because of the structural reinforcement techniques we developed for the Westfield Library. He consulted with me directly on his Cambridge renovation last year and expressed interest in our preservation-compliant modernization approach, which is my area of expertise, not James's. The room fell silent. My father's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, while James blinked in evident surprise at my uncharacteristic challenge. "Olivia," my father said after a moment, his tone carrying a warning, "we've already discussed this. James will handle the Anderson relationship. You can certainly contribute the technical components to his presentation." "With respect," I continued, surprising even myself with my persistence. "The Anderson Tower requires specialized knowledge of preservation regulations and structural engineering solutions that I've developed over the past decade. Our competitive advantage for this project comes directly from methodologies I created and implemented. It would be more effective for me to lead this proposal, with James supporting the client relationship aspects." James's smile had frozen in place. "Livy, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I've already established rapport with Roger. Changing the point person now would send a confusing message." "It's not about who has rapport," I replied evenly. "It's about who has the expertise this project requires." The Anderson Tower presents unique challenges that align precisely with the specialized approach I've developed. Roger already knows this. It's why he approached our company in the first place. My father's hand came down firmly on the table. "That's enough, Olivia. This isn't the appropriate venue for this discussion. The decision has been made. James will lead the Anderson proposal, and that's final." I looked around the table, noting the uncomfortable expressions of my colleagues. They knew, of course. Everyone who worked closely with our projects understood who drove the technical innovations, who solved the complex engineering challenges, who developed the methodologies that had earned us industry recognition. Yet the fiction persisted, reinforced by the family hierarchy that placed James's limited contributions above my substantial ones. "If we're positioning ourselves based on our sustainable historic renovation expertise," I said carefully, "then we should put forward the person who actually developed that expertise. Otherwise, we're misrepresenting our capabilities to the client." "No one is misrepresenting anything," my father replied sharply. "Chambers Construction operates as a team, with each person fulfilling their defined role. James's role is client-facing, leadership. Your role is operational implementation. That structure has built this company into what it is today, and I won't have it questioned in front of our staff." The rebuke was public and pointed. In the past, it would have silenced me immediately, sending me back to the familiar pattern of silent accomplishment and diverted credit. But something fundamental had shifted. perhaps beginning with the Legacy Award ceremony and crystallizing during my Sunday reflection. What built this company, I said, my voice quiet but firm, is innovation in sustainable historic renovation. Innovation that I conceived, developed, and implemented. The Legacy Award we just received recognizes methodologies I created, client relationships I cultivated, and projects I directed. If we're going to have an honest discussion about our company's structure and success, we need to acknowledge the actual contributions that drive our growth, not maintain a fictional narrative that misaligns expertise with authority. The silence that followed was profound. Thomas Wilson studied his financial reports with sudden intensity. Our marketing director examined her manicure. The HR manager seemed to be contemplating a career change. Only the lead project manager, Michael Chen, met my gaze with a slight nod of support. He worked directly with me on our most complex projects and knew precisely who solved the critical challenges. I think, my father said eventually, his voice dangerously controlled, that we should table this discussion and move on to financial updates. Thomas? The CFO cleared his throat uncomfortably and began reviewing quarterly projections. The meeting continued with stilted professionalism, each agenda item addressed with minimal discussion. When it concluded 40 minutes later, my father gestured for me to remain while others filed out. James lingered as well, his expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance. As the door closed behind the last departing executive, my father turned to me with barely contained anger. What exactly was that performance about, Olivia? We don't air internal disagreements in front of staff. It wasn't a performance, I replied. It was an attempt to align our project leadership with the actual expertise required. The Anderson Tower is the most complex preservation project we've pursued. It needs someone with in-depth knowledge of the technical challenges involved. And you think James isn't capable of presenting our company's capabilities? My father demanded. Presenting, yes. Actually understanding or implementing them, no. The bluntness of my response surprised even me. James is excellent at client relations and publicity, but he doesn't understand the structural engineering principles, preservation compliance requirements, or sustainable systems integration that make our approach successful. He can't answer technical questions about methodologies he didn't develop and doesn't fully comprehend. James shifted uncomfortably. That's unfair, Livy. I've been representing our technical capabilities to clients for years. Representing them, yes. Creating them, no. I turned to face him directly. James, be honest. Could you explain our approach to load redistribution in structurally compromised historic buildings? Or our phased integration methodology for updating mechanical systems while maintaining historical elements? These are fundamental to the Anderson proposal, and they're systems I developed. He hesitated, confirming what we all knew. James could deliver polished presentations based on materials I prepared, but he couldn't engage meaningfully on the technical substance that differentiated our company from competitors. That's why we have a team, my father interjected. James handles client relationships and overall direction. You handle technical implementation. Together, you create successful projects. Why are you suddenly challenging an arrangement that has worked for years? The question caught me off guard with its fundamental misconception. The arrangement had never worked from my perspective. I had simply accepted it, burying my frustration beneath professional dedication and familial loyalty. The Legacy Award ceremony had simply made the disparity too glaring to ignore any longer. It hasn't worked, I said finally. It's created a fiction where James receives credit for innovations and expertise that are mine. It's misled clients about who actually drives our projects, and it's prevented me from receiving professional recognition for my contributions to the company and the industry. My father's expression hardened. This company functions as a unified entity, not a collection of individual achievements. Your brother represents Chambers Construction to the public and clients. That's the structure I established, and it's not changing because you suddenly want more attention. The dismissal stung with its fundamental mischaracterization of my concerns. This wasn't about attention. It was about accurate representation of expertise, about honest attribution of innovation, about aligning client expectations with actual capabilities. This isn't about attention, I said quietly. It's about truth. And the truth is that I've been the primary architect of this company's technical evolution and market positioning for the past decade. Pretending otherwise doesn't serve our clients, our staff, or ultimately our company. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he'd had since childhood. Where is this coming from, Livy? You've never had a problem with our arrangement before. I've always had a problem with it, I admitted. I just prioritized company success and family harmony over my own professional recognition. But after the Legacy Award, watching you and Dad accept an honor for innovations I created, hearing Dad attribute my work to your vision, something changed. I realized I'm not just enabling a harmless family dynamic. I'm participating in a misrepresentation that undermines my professional identity and the integrity of our company. My father stood abruptly, signaling the end of the discussion. You're overreacting to perceived slights. This conversation is over. James will lead the Anderson proposal as planned. If you can't support that decision professionally, perhaps you need to reconsider your position in this company. The implicit threat hung in the air as he strode from the room, leaving James and me in uncomfortable silence. My brother studied, me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Part confusion, part defensiveness, perhaps even a flicker of guilt. I've never claimed credit for your technical work, he said finally. Not directly. You've never corrected anyone who attributed it to you, I countered, including Dad, industry publications, or clients. You've accepted awards, recognition, and advancement based largely on my innovations. Your silence is its own form of claiming credit. He had no immediate response to this, perhaps confronting for the first time the ethical implications of our long-standing arrangement. I have a meeting, I said, gathering my materials. We can continue this discussion later if you'd like. As I returned to my office, I felt strangely calm despite the confrontation. For years, I had suppressed my frustration, rationalized the inequity, and channeled my energy into work rather than recognition. Speaking the truth, even if it changed nothing in our company's structure, had lifted a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. Marcus Harrington arrived precisely at the scheduled time, carrying a slim leather portfolio and exhibiting the same quiet attentiveness I had noted at the gala. I had arranged the regulatory documentation chronologically, from initial concept through various iterations to current implementation. Thank you for making time for this review, he said as we settled in my office. The regulatory modernization initiative I'm leading aims to identify best practices that balance preservation requirements with practical implementation. Your approach at Chambers Construction represents one of the most effective models I've encountered. I appreciate your interest, I replied. The framework evolved organically as I worked to reconcile competing demands in historic renovation. These are the original development materials, including the initial concept I created during my graduate studies, and the implementation strategy I developed when joining the company. Harrington examined the documents with professional thoroughness, occasionally asking insightful questions about specific methodologies. His understanding of both regulatory requirements and practical construction challenges was impressive, allowing our discussion to explore nuanced aspects of the compliance system. This is remarkable work, he said after nearly an hour of review. The integration of preservation standards with contemporary efficiency requirements is elegantly structured, and it's clear from the documentation that this framework has been your creation from inception through implementation. I nodded, a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability washing over me. Having my work recognized so directly by an industry expert was both validating and unfamiliar. Yet at the awards ceremony, he continued carefully, your father and brother seem to present a different narrative about the company's innovation leadership. The observation hung in the air between us, neither accusation nor question, but demanding response nonetheless. In that moment, I faced a choice that would shape both my professional future and my family relationships. I could maintain the diplomatic facade that had preserved family harmony at the cost of my professional recognition. Or I could speak the truth to someone in a position to understand its significance and implications. Yes, I said simply. They did. Harrington's expression remained neutral, but his attention intensified. May I ask why? From these materials and our discussions, it's evident that you've been the primary architect of your company's most significant innovations and competitive advantages. I considered my response carefully, aware of both professional implications and personal loyalties. Chambers Construction was founded by my father and functions as a family business. The leadership structure reflects family dynamics as much as professional considerations. My father and brother handle client relationships and public representation. I manage operations, technical development, and project implementation. Even when the public representation misattributes innovations that are demonstrably yours? Harrington asked. The question was direct but not judgmental. It was the same question I had been asking myself with increasing frequency since the Legacy Award ceremony. Even then, I acknowledged. Until recently, I prioritized company success and family harmony over personal recognition. And now? His question was gentle but penetrating. I glanced at the extensive documentation spread across my conference table, tangible evidence of my expertise, creativity, and professional contribution. Years of work that had transformed a conventional construction company into an industry leader in sustainable historic renovation. Innovation that had been systematically attributed to James while I remained in the operational shadows. Now, I said with quiet conviction, I believe accurate representation matters, for clients who deserve to know who's actually driving their projects, for industry standards that should acknowledge their true developers, and for my own professional opportunity. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. The Regulatory Modernization Initiative includes a comprehensive audit of significant projects from the past decade, examining documentation trails to identify actual best practices rather than publicly claimed ones. He paused. The audit findings will become public record, accessible to industry publications, clients, and regulatory bodies. The implication was clear. An official audit would reveal exactly what the company's internal documents already showed, that I had been the primary architect of Chambers Construction's most significant innovations, despite public attribution to James. I believe in transparency, I said carefully. If Chambers Construction's projects are included in your audit, I will ensure all documentation accurately reflects the actual development process and implementation responsibilities. Even if that contradicts the public narrative your company has presented, he asked. Truth serves everyone's interests in the long run, I replied, even when it's uncomfortable in the moment. As Harrington gathered his notes and prepared to leave, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, Ms. Chambers, the industry would benefit from greater awareness of your contributions. Innovation deserves proper attribution, not just for individual recognition, but for the advancement of best practices across the field. After he departed, I remained at my desk, contemplating the implications of our conversation. The regulatory audit would create an official record of who had actually developed the methodologies that had earned Chambers Construction its reputation and success. That record would contradict years of family-approved messaging attributing my innovations to James's leadership. The conflict I had avoided for a decade was now inevitable. By simply ensuring accurate documentation in the upcoming audit, I would challenge the fiction my father had constructed and maintained. The truth would emerge not through confrontation or accusation, but through the impartial evidence of project records, design documents, and implementation protocols. My phone chimed with a message from my father. My office. Now. The abruptness suggested he had already heard about my meeting with Harrington, perhaps from our receptionist or another staff member. The confrontation I had anticipated would arrive sooner than expected. The walk from my office to my father's took precisely 47 seconds, a journey I had made countless times over the years, usually to receive instructions rather than engage in genuine dialogue. Today, each step felt weighted with significance. This confrontation would mark a turning point, though I couldn't yet foresee exactly where the new path might lead. My father's executive suite occupied the entire northwest corner of the top floor, with commanding views of both the harbor and the downtown skyline. Unlike my functional workspace, his office was designed to impress clients and visitors. Leather furniture, maritime antiques, and framed magazine features highlighting Chambers Construction's most prestigious projects. I noticed immediately that I wouldn't be facing him alone. James sat in one of the visitor chairs, his expression uncharacteristically solemn. My mother, who rarely appeared at the office despite her official title as Vice President of Community Relations, perched on the leather sofa beneath a large framed photograph of our family at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for our headquarters building. The staged image showed my father and James holding the ceremonial scissors, while my mother and I stood slightly behind them, a visual representation of the company hierarchy that had crystallized over the years. "Close the door," my father instructed without preamble. I complied, then took the remaining visitor chair, arranging my tablet and notebook precisely on my lap, a small ritual that helped center me for what was sure to be a difficult conversation. "Would you care to explain," my father began, his voice controlled but tight with anger, "why you spent over an hour with the regulatory director showing him internal documents and claiming credit for company innovations that have been developed under James's leadership?" The mischaracterization was so fundamental that for a moment, I simply stared at him, wondering if he genuinely believed this version of reality, or if it was merely the narrative he had committed to so completely that he could no longer distinguish between fiction and fact. "I didn't claim credit for anything," I replied evenly. "I showed Harrington the regulatory compliance framework I developed, as he requested. The documentation simply reflects the reality of who created those systems. Those systems were developed by Chambers Construction as a company," my father countered. "James has overseen all strategic initiatives since becoming executive vice president 5 years ago." "Overseeing is not the same as creating," I said. "The regulatory framework Harrington reviewed was initially conceived during my graduate studies, before I even joined the company. I implemented it when I came aboard, and I've refined it through successive projects. James has presented it to clients, but he didn't develop it." My mother leaned forward, her expression conciliatory. "Olivia, honey, no one is discounting your contributions. You're an essential part of the team. But there's a reason family businesses establish clear leadership structures. Your father built this company from nothing, and he's determined the succession plan that best serves our long-term interests." "This isn't about succession," I clarified. "It's about accurate representation of who does what within the company. The regulatory audit Harrington is conducting will examine documentation trails for major projects. Those records will show who actually developed the methodologies that have defined our success over the past decade." My father's expression darkened. "And you're planning to ensure those records contradict the public image we've established with clients and the industry, an image that has built our reputation and secured our contracts." "I'm planning to ensure those records reflect the truth," I corrected. "If that contradicts the narrative you've created, that suggests the problem lies with the narrative, not the records." James cleared his throat, speaking for the first time. "Livy, we understand you feel your contributions haven't been sufficiently acknowledged. We can discuss adjusting how we present the team dynamics moving forward, but deliberately undermining the company's established leadership structure through this audit seems extreme. The reasonableness of his tone contrasted sharply with the fundamental dishonesty of his position. For years, he had accepted credit for innovations he barely understood, much less created. Now he characterized my insistence on accurate documentation as extreme, while positioning himself as the voice of moderation. "I'm not undermining anything," I replied. "I'm simply ensuring that official records accurately reflect who developed what. The audit will examine documentation that already exists, project specifications, development records, implementation protocols. Those materials have always shown who actually created our methodologies. The only difference is that now, they'll be reviewed by someone outside the family. And you don't see how that could damage the company?" my father demanded. "If clients who have worked with James for years suddenly discover he wasn't actually responsible for the innovations they've attributed to him?" The question revealed the heart of the matter. My father wasn't concerned about the truth, but about preserving the image he had constructed around James as the company's visionary leader. "I think clients deserve to know who's actually driving their projects," I said quietly. "I think our staff deserves to have their actual reporting structure acknowledged. And I think I deserve recognition for the innovations I've created." My mother sighed, glancing between my father and me with the expression she had often worn during family disagreements, part mediator, part enforcer of my father's authority. "Olivia, surely you understand that family businesses operate differently than conventional corporations," she said. "Your father has built this company with a vision for its future that extends beyond individual contributions. James represents the next generation of leadership, carrying forward the Chamber's name and legacy." "And what about my contribution to that legacy?" I asked. "Does that simply get absorbed into James's public narrative? Do I continue implementing innovations that get attributed to his vision regardless of his actual involvement?" "You make it sound like you've received no recognition," James protested. "You're the COO of a major construction firm at 35. You have an executive office, a significant salary, and authority over operational decisions." "Authority. That's regularly undermined when you or Dad override my decisions," I pointed out. "Recognition that's consistently diminished when my innovations are presented as yours. A title that means little when clients are told you're responsible for work I've actually performed." My father stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the harbor. From this vantage point, several Chambers construction projects were visible. The renovated hotel on the waterfront, the restored customs house, the modernized warehouse district we had transformed into mixed-use development. Projects I had largely conceived, designed, and implemented, though James had accepted the industry accolades for each. "I built this company from nothing," he said without turning around. "Started with a pickup truck and a toolbox, worked 16-hour days. For decades. Everything we have, this office, your education, your position, comes from my sacrifice and vision." The familiar narrative was designed to evoke both gratitude and obligation. I had heard versions of it throughout my life, deployed whenever my father encountered resistance to his authority. Today, however, it struck me differently, as a fundamental misunderstanding of how the modern company had actually evolved. "You built the original residential construction business," I acknowledged, "and that foundation was essential. But the company we are today, the award-winning sustainable renovation firm with national recognition, that transformation happened after I joined. The methodologies that distinguish us from competitors are ones I developed. The projects that define our current reputation are ones I've led." My father turned from the window, his expression hardening. "And you think that gives you the right to undermine the leadership structure I've established? To contradict the company narrative we've presented to clients for years?" "I think it gives me the right to have my actual contributions acknowledged," I replied. "I think it obligates me to ensure company records accurately reflect who developed what. and I think it's time to align our public representation with the reality of how this company actually functions. My mother rose from the sofa, approaching my chair with the conciliatory expression she typically employed when mediating family conflicts. Olivia, we understand you're feeling underappreciated. Perhaps we haven't sufficiently acknowledged your technical contributions. But surely there's a way to address this without disrupting the company structure your father has carefully established. Her characterization of my concerns as merely feeling underappreciated minimized what was actually a systematic misattribution of my professional work. Another example of how my family consistently diminished legitimate issues to maintain their preferred narrative. This isn't about appreciation, I clarified. It's about accurate representation of expertise and innovation. The regulatory audit will create an official record of who actually developed the methodologies that define our company. That record should reflect reality, not reinforce a misleading narrative. My father's patience visibly evaporated. Enough. I've made my position clear. James represents the leadership of Chambers Construction to clients and the industry. That arrangement has built our success and will continue. If you can't accept that structure, perhaps it's time to reconsider your position in this company. The implied threat hung in the air, clarifying what had been implicit throughout my years with the company. My contributions were welcome as long as they enhanced James's reputation, but my insistence on accurate attribution was viewed as disloyalty to the family narrative. I've accepted that structure for 12 years, I said, rising from my chair. I've watched my innovations attributed to James, my client relationships transferred to his management, my expertise presented as his vision. I've prioritized company success and family harmony over professional recognition. But I won't actively participate in misleading an official regulatory audit. The documentation will reflect the truth of who developed what. I gathered my materials and moved toward the door, pausing with my hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I've never questioned James's value to the company. His client relationship skills and public presentation abilities are genuine assets. I've simply wanted acknowledgement of my distinct contributions rather than having them absorbed into his narrative. My father's expression remained unyielding. This discussion is over. You have a choice to make about your future with Chambers Construction. The ultimatum was clear. Continue accepting the established fiction of James as the company's innovation, leader, or face potential exclusion from the family business. It was a crossroads I had anticipated but hoped to avoid through reasoned discussion. Now that it had arrived, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity. I'll make that choice, I replied. But first, I'll ensure the regulatory documentation accurately reflects reality. The company's future should be built on truth, not convenient fictions. I closed the door quietly behind me, ignoring the muffled sound of my father's angry response. The walk back to my office seemed longer than usual. Each step weighted with the gravity of what had just transpired. For the first time in my professional life, I had directly challenged the family narrative that minimized my contributions. The consequences remained to be seen, but the path forward was increasingly clear. My assistant looked up anxiously as I entered the outer office. Everything okay? The executive team has been buzzing about your meeting with the regulatory director. I managed a reassuring smile despite my inner turmoil. Everything's fine. Just preparing documentation for the regulatory audit, standard procedure. In my private office, I closed the door and moved to the balcony that overlooked the harbor. The afternoon sun glinted off the water, illuminating the historic buildings Chambers Construction had renovated over the years. Each structure represented countless hours of my innovation, problem-solving, and leadership. Tangible monuments to work that had been systematically attributed to James in company narratives. My phone vibrated with an incoming message from Megan. Mom called in distress. Apparently you're mounting a challenge to the family business structure? What happened? I couldn't help but smile at how quickly family communications had escalated. Had meeting with regulatory director. Showed him documentation of systems I developed. Dad and James interpreting this as corporate coup attempt. About time, came her immediate response. What triggered this after all these years of silent acquiescence? It was a fair question. I had accepted the uneven attribution of credit for over a decade, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than public recognition. What had changed? Legacy award was tipping point, I typed. Watching them accept industry recognition for my innovations while barely acknowledging my existence. Then regulatory audit announced that we'll examine documentation trails. Truth is going to emerge whether family narrative acknowledges it or not. Megan's reply was characteristically direct. They've presented you with the loyal daughter or fired executive ultimatum yet? Essentially, Dad made it clear I either accept James getting credit for my work or reconsider my position with the company. There was a longer pause before her response arrived. And what are you going to do? It was the central question, the one I had been gradually moving toward since the award ceremony. The confrontation with my father and James had crystallized. Options that had been forming in my mind for months. Ensure audit documentation accurately reflects who developed what, I replied. After that, considering my options. About damn time, Megan wrote. For what it's worth, I've watched this dynamic play out for 12 years, and you've been far more patient than I would have been. Whatever you decide, I'm in your corner. Her support meant more than she likely realized. Having grown up in the same family dynamic, Megan understood the complex interplay of expectations, obligations, and unspoken rules that had shaped our professional choices. Her validation helped confirm that I wasn't overreacting to legitimate concerns. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop, navigating to the folder containing plans for the independent consultancy I had sketched out periodically over the years. The business model was sound, leveraging my expertise in sustainable historic renovation to serve clients directly rather than through the filter of Chambers Construction's family hierarchy. I had contacts throughout the industry, a reputation among those who worked directly with our projects, and demonstrable results from the innovations I had implemented. What I had lacked until now was the catalyst to make such a significant break from the family business, and the confidence that my individual contribution was substantial enough to stand alone without the Chambers construction infrastructure. The Legacy Award and Harrington's forthright acknowledgement of my expertise had provided both. I began updating the business plan, energized by the possibilities that emerged once I removed the constraints of family expectations. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully envision a professional identity separate from the narrative my father had constructed, one where my innovations were directly attributed to their source, where my expertise was the centerpiece rather than a supporting element of someone else's story. The regulatory audit would create an official record of my contributions to Chambers Construction's success. That documentation would serve as both validation of my past work and foundation for whatever path I chose moving forward. Whether I remained with the family business under renegotiated terms or established my own venture, the truth of my professional contributions would finally be accurately represented. As the afternoon light shifted across my office, I found myself experiencing an emotion I hadn't anticipated in the midst of family conflict: hope. Not just for professional recognition, but for authentic alignment between my work and its acknowledgement. For 12 years, I had accepted the disparity between contribution and credit as the price of family harmony. Now I understood that genuine harmony couldn't be built on systematic misattribution and convenient fictions. Whatever came next, confrontation or compromise, continuation or separation, would be grounded in truth rather than comfortable illusions. That alone represented a form of victory, regardless of the specific outcome. The following morning arrived. With the crystalline clarity that often follows difficult decisions, I had spent the evening refining my independent business plan, researching office space options, and creating a timeline for potential transition. While I hadn't definitively decided to leave Chambers Construction, I was determined to be prepared for that possibility if my father made good on his implied ultimatum. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, wanting time to organize the regulatory documentation before the day's meetings began. The Westfield Library restoration required critical decisions about structural reinforcement that couldn't be delayed regardless of family drama. Client projects and employee responsibilities continued, family conflict notwithstanding. When I reached my office, I immediately sensed something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered locking it the previous evening. Inside, the careful arrangement of regulatory documents I had assembled for Harrington's review was noticeably disturbed. Several folders were missing entirely, and others had been rearranged. "Andrea," I called to my assistant, who was just settling at her desk, "did someone access my office overnight?" She looked up with evident concern. "Not that I'm aware of. Security protocols would have required my authorization or another executive's. Should I check the access logs?" "Please do," I replied, already cataloging what appeared to be missing. The original development materials for our regulatory compliance framework, my graduate thesis that had formed its foundation, my implementation, notes from the initial projects, the progression documentation showing how I had refined the methodology over successive renovations. The most direct evidence of my authorship had been selectively removed. Andrea returned looking troubled. "The access logs show James was here at 7:15 last night, authorized by your father to retrieve family business documents from your office." I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. Family business documents was how my father categorized materials he considered company property rather than individual work product. By that definition, the innovations I had developed while employed by Chambers Construction belonged to the company rather than to me personally, a technically accurate but ethically questionable classification when used to obscure individual authorship. "Has James arrived yet?" I asked. "He's in a meeting with your father and the legal team," Andrea replied. "Started about 20 minutes ago." The implications were clear. My father and brother were consulting with legal counsel, likely to establish ownership claims over the documentation I had shown Harrington. While they couldn't prevent the regulatory audit, they could potentially limit what materials were available for review and how those materials were contextualized. I took a moment to assess my options. Direct confrontation would escalate the situation without necessarily resolving it. Legal maneuvering would drain energy better directed toward client projects and strategic planning, and both approaches would further damage already strained family relationships. Fortunately, I had anticipated this possibility. While the original development materials held sentimental and historical value, they weren't the only evidence of my authorship. Digital copies existed on secure servers, protected by encryption and access controls I had implemented when I first recognized the pattern of credit diversion. More importantly, the regulatory submissions themselves, filed with local, state, and federal agencies over the years, contained consistent indicators of my development role, from digital signatures to correspondence records to revision histories. My phone chimed with a text from James. "We need to clarify documentation protocols for the regulatory audit. Dad's office, 11 a.m. The formal tone was unlike his usual communication style, suggesting the message had been crafted with legal guidance. This wasn't a request, but a summoning, designed to establish authority rather than engage in dialogue. I responded simply, "I'll be there." The 3 hours before the meeting were filled with project oversight and client calls, the daily operational responsibilities that didn't pause for family conflict. I reviewed structural assessments for the Westfield Library, approved material modifications for the Cambridge Hotel renovation, and addressed permitting complications for our Providence warehouse conversion. Through each interaction with project managers and technical specialists, I was acutely aware of how seamlessly the company's operations functioned under my direction, and how completely this reality contradicted the public narrative attributing our success to James's leadership. At precisely 11:00, I arrived at my father's office, tablet in hand containing digital copies of the materials that had been removed from my office. James and my father were already seated behind the imposing mahogany desk, with our company's legal counsel, Patricia Reynolds, positioned to their right. The seating arrangement was clearly designed to create an adversarial dynamic. 3 authorities aligned against me. "Olivia," my father began without preamble, "we need to establish clear protocols for the regulatory audit. Patricia has prepared documentation guidelines that align with our company's official organizational structure." Patricia slid a folder across the desk. "These guidelines clarify the attribution hierarchy for company innovations and methodologies. As you'll see, they reflect the established leadership roles within Chambers Construction, with project initiatives flowing from executive direction to operational implementation." I opened the folder and scanned the document inside. A carefully crafted narrative that positioned James as the visionary architect of our sustainable renovation approach, with my role characterized as technical implementation of his strategic direction. The regulatory compliance framework I had developed was specifically described as conceived through executive leadership and implemented through operational processes. "This is a fiction," I said, closing the folder. "It contradicts the actual development history documented in our project records." My father's expression tightened. "It reflects the organizational structure I established for this company. James provides strategic direction as Executive Vice President. You implement that direction as Chief Operations Officer. The documentation we provide for the regulatory audit will reflect those roles. Even when the documentation trail clearly shows I developed these methodologies independently, often before they were ever presented to James or the executive team," I asked. "Individual contributions exist within the context of organizational hierarchy," Patricia interjected smoothly. "Your technical expertise is acknowledged within the framework of leadership direction provided by James and your father." The corporate doublespeak was designed to maintain the fiction while seeming to offer recognition, a strategy I had encountered repeatedly throughout my tenure at Chambers Construction. "The regulatory audit will examine actual documentation," I pointed out. "Project records, development histories, implementation protocols. Those materials consistently show my authorship of the methodologies in question." "Some of those materials were created during your employment here and represent company intellectual property," Patricia replied. "As such, they need to be contextualized within our established organizational structure." "You mean the original documents that were removed from my office last night?" I asked, looking directly at James. He had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable before regaining his professional composure. "Dad asked me to gather relevant company materials for legal review. As Executive VP, I have authority to access all company documentation." "Removing evidence of authorship doesn't change who actually created the work," I said. "The regulatory audit will still reveal the truth through submitted filings, correspondence records, and implementation documentation." My father leaned forward, his patience visibly thinning. "This isn't about erasing your contribution, Olivia. It's about presenting a consistent organizational narrative that serves the company's interests. James represents the leadership of Chambers Construction to clients and regulators. The audit documentation needs to align with that established structure. Even when that structure misrepresents who actually developed the methodologies being evaluated?" I asked. "It represents how this company functions," my father insisted. "Strategic direction flows from executive leadership. Technical implementation comes from operations. That's the structure I've built over decades, and it's not changing because you suddenly want more recognition." The fundamental misconception that this was about recognition rather than accurate representation remained at the heart of our disagreement. My father couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge that the innovative approaches that had transformed the company had originated from me rather than flowing down from James's strategic direction. The audit documentation needs to reflect reality, I said simply. The regulatory compliance framework being evaluated was conceived during my graduate studies, implemented when I joined the company, and refined through successive projects under my direction. James has presented it to clients, but he didn't develop it. Your work exists within the context of James's leadership portfolio, Patricia stated, as if repetition could transform fiction into fact. The audit documentation will reflect that organizational reality. I opened my tablet and pulled up one of the digital copies I had secured. This is my graduate thesis from MIT, completed before I joined Chambers Construction. It outlines the fundamental approach to regulatory compliance that formed the foundation of our current methodology. I swiped to another document. This is the implementation proposal I submitted when I joined the company. Against significant resistance, I might add, it details the specific processes that have since become our standard approach. Another swipe. This is the revision history showing how I refined the methodology through successive projects, incorporating feedback from regulatory agencies and implementation teams. James's name doesn't appear in any of the development documentation because he wasn't involved in creating these systems. My father's expression hardened. Those documents represent early conceptual work that was ultimately shaped by executive direction into our current methodologies. That's simply not true, I replied, my frustration finally bleeding into my tone. And the regulatory audit will confirm that. The documentation trail is clear and consistent. I developed these approaches, implemented them through successive projects, and refined them into the systems being evaluated. Trying to retrofit James into that development narrative after the fact won't withstand scrutiny. Patricia cleared her throat. We're not suggesting removing your contribution from the record, Olivia. We're establishing proper attribution within the company's organizational structure. The final documentation will acknowledge your technical implementation while appropriately positioning James's leadership role. You can't acknowledge something while simultaneously misattributing it, I pointed out. Either the documentation reflects who actually developed these methodologies, or it perpetuates a fiction designed to enhance James's professional reputation at the expense of mine. My father stood abruptly, signaling his diminishing patience. Enough. The documentation guidelines Patricia has prepared represent the official company position. As an employee of Chambers Construction, you're expected to adhere to these protocols in all interactions with the regulatory audit team. The ultimatum was now explicit. Comply with the fictional narrative or face the consequences. I felt a strange sense of relief at having the conflict finally clarified in such unambiguous terms. I understand the company position, I said, carefully. But I cannot and will not misrepresent my professional work to regulatory authorities. The audit documentation will reflect the actual development history of these methodologies, not a retrofitted narrative designed to credit James with innovations he didn't create. Us? You're placing your personal agenda above company interests, my father said, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm placing accuracy and integrity above a convenient fiction, I countered. The company's genuine interests are best served by honest representation of how our innovations were actually developed. The silence that followed was heavy with unresolved tension. James studied the surface of the desk, seemingly uncomfortable with the direct confrontation, despite benefiting from the misattribution at its center. Patricia maintained her professional neutrality, though her slight frown suggested she recognized the potential legal complications of deliberately misrepresenting development documentation in a regulatory audit. You have a choice to make, my father said finally. Either you support the company position regarding audit documentation, or you need to reconsider your future with Chambers Construction. It was the ultimatum I had anticipated since our initial confrontation. Accept, continuing misattribution of my work or leave the company I had helped transform. The clarity of this crossroads brought with it an unexpected sense of calm. "I'll make that decision," I replied, gathering my materials. "But regardless of my employment status, the regulatory audit documentation will reflect the truth of who developed these methodologies. That's non-negotiable." As I turned to leave, James spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Livy, can't we find a compromise here? Something that acknowledges your technical contribution while maintaining our established leadership structure?" The question revealed both his discomfort with the conflict and his fundamental misunderstanding of my position. This wasn't about finding a middle ground between truth and fiction. It was about accurate representation of professional work. "The compromise has been me accepting misattribution of my innovations for 12 years, I replied. "I'm not willing to extend that compromise to deliberately misleading regulatory authorities about who developed methodologies they're formally evaluating." My father's expression hardened further. "Then perhaps it's time for you to take a leave of absence while you reconsider your priorities and commitment to this company." The implied suspension was clearly designed to remove me from direct involvement with the regulatory audit, a desperate attempt to control the narrative as the documentation review proceeded. "A leave of absence won't change the development history documented in our project records," I pointed out. "The audit will reveal who actually created these methodologies, whether I'm in this office or not." I left without waiting for further response, maintaining my professional composure until reaching the privacy of my own office. Once there, I closed the door and moved to the balcony, taking deep breaths of the harbor air as I processed what had just transpired. The family business dynamics that had shaped my professional life for 12 years had finally reached their breaking point. My father and James were willing to actively misrepresent the development history of our company's innovations, not just in marketing materials or client presentations, but in official regulatory documentation. They were prepared to suspend me rather than acknowledge my authorship of methodologies that had transformed Chambers Construction from a conventional contractor to an industry leader. The situation had evolved beyond issues of recognition or credit. It now involved deliberate misrepresentation to regulatory authorities, an ethical breach I couldn't ignore or accommodate, regardless of family loyalties or professional consequences. My phone vibrated with a text message from Marcus Harrington. "Meeting set with audit team next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Please bring complete documentation of regulatory compliance framework development, including original conceptualization, implementation, strategy, and revision history." The timing left me 5 days to prepare comprehensive documentation that would accurately reflect the development history of our sustainable renovation approach, and to determine whether that presentation would occur as a current executive of Chambers Construction or as its former chief operations officer. Whatever my father decided regarding my employment status, one thing was now certain. The company records would finally be made public, revealing exactly who had built the methodologies that defined Chambers Construction's success. The truth, I had subordinated to family harmony for 12 years, would finally emerge, with consequences that would reshape both the company narrative and my professional identity. As difficult as the confrontation had been, it brought with it a profound sense of liberation. After years of accepting misattribution of my work for the sake of family peace, I had finally drawn a boundary that honored both my professional integrity and the truth of how our company's innovations had actually developed. My assistant appeared at the balcony door. "Your father has called an emergency executive meeting at 4 p.m. Should I clear your schedule?" I looked out over the harbor, watching boats navigate the complex currents with precise adjustments and clear direction. "No," I replied after a moment. "I have client commitments this afternoon that take priority. Please inform my father I'll be addressing urgent project needs." It was a small assertion of independence, choosing client obligations over a meeting, clearly designed to manage the fallout from our confrontation. but it represented a fundamental shift in my approach to the family business dynamic. For the first time, I was prioritizing professional integrity over family expectations, and truth over convenient narratives. Whatever came next, continued. Conflict, negotiated resolution, or professional separation would unfold on terms shaped by reality rather than fiction. The company records would speak for themselves, revealing who had truly built the methodologies that defined Chambers Construction's success. And in that revelation lay both vindication for years of unacknowledged innovation and the foundation for whatever professional path I chose moving forward. By Friday morning, the tension within Chambers Construction had evolved from private family conflict to company-wide awareness. Though no official announcement had been made, the strained interactions between the executive team members, my conspicuous absence from the emergency meeting, and the unusual presence of legal counsel on site had sparked inevitable speculation among staff. I arrived at the office to find Andrea fielding concerned inquiries from project managers and department heads, all sensing the unusual dynamics, but lacking clear information about their implications for ongoing projects and reporting structures. "Everyone's asking what's happening," she informed me quietly as I sorted through the morning correspondence. "Michael Chen called twice about whether he should continue direct reporting to you for the Westfield project or redirect through James, as requested yesterday." This was the first I'd heard of any change to reporting protocols, a concerning indication that my father was already implementing structural adjustments to diminish my authority within the company. "Tell Michael to continue reporting directly to me regarding all technical and implementation aspects of Westfield," I replied. "The project requires specialized expertise that needs consistent oversight." I spent the first hour of the morning reassuring key team members about project continuity and operational protocols. Years of building trusted relationships with staff meant most looked to me for guidance during uncertainty, regardless of the official hierarchy my father had established. At 9:30, my phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source, Roger Anderson, the developer behind the prestigious tower renovation that had become a point of contention in our family conflict. "Olivia, heard some concerning rumors about structural changes at Chambers. The Anderson Tower requires your specific expertise on preservation-compliant retrofitting. Can we meet directly to discuss? Lunch today? Roger." The message confirmed what I had suspected. Our industry partners recognized where the technical expertise actually resided within Chambers Construction, regardless of who represented the ICOM company at networking events and awards ceremonies. Roger Anderson wasn't interested in James's client relationship skills. He wanted the specialized knowledge I had developed for integrating modern systems into historic structures. I replied, confirming the lunch meeting, then continued addressing operational priorities that couldn't wait for resolution of the family conflict. The Westfield Library project faced critical decision points about structural reinforcement that required immediate attention. The Cambridge Hotel renovation needed revised material specifications to address unexpected conditions revealed during demolition. The Providence warehouse conversion awaited final approval on sustainable systems integration before the next construction phase could proceed. These complex technical challenges, the substance of our company's actual work rather than its public representation, remained my responsibility regardless of executive power struggles. I wouldn't allow client projects to suffer because of family dynamics. At 10:45, James appeared at my office door. His typical confident demeanor had been replaced by an uncharacteristic hesitancy, suggesting he recognized the precariousness of the situation despite the apparent power advantage our father had granted him. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Not as executives, as siblings." I gestured to the visitor chair, closing my laptop to signal willingness for genuine conversation despite our professional conflict. "Dad's planning to announce a reorganization this afternoon," he began, settling into the chair with a sigh. "He's creating a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, that would oversee all technical development under my direct supervision. Your role would be redefined as Operations Implementation Director, focused on executing established methodologies rather than developing new approaches. The restructuring was a transparent attempt to institutionalize the fiction that James directed the company's innovation while I merely implemented his vision, a corporate manifestation of the narrative my parents had maintained throughout our professional lives. And the regulatory audit? I asked. Is Dad planning to present this retroactive restructuring as if it's been our operational reality all along? James looked uncomfortable. The official position is that the reorganization formalizes existing functional relationships within the company. Patricia has prepared documentation explaining that I've provided strategic direction for technical innovations while you've handled implementation details. Implementation details, I repeated, the phrase highlighting the systematic diminishment of my contributions. Is that how you genuinely view my role in this company, James? As implementing details of innovations you've directed? He shifted in his chair, avoiding direct eye contact. It's complicated, Liv. You know I value your technical expertise. But Dad has always been clear about the leadership structure he envisions for Chambers construction. I'm trying to navigate a middle path that preserves both the company hierarchy and acknowledges your contributions. There is no middle path between truth and fiction, I pointed out. Either you developed these methodologies, or I did. The regulatory audit will examine documentation that clearly shows the actual development history. No amount of organizational restructuring can retroactively change who created these approaches. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration dating back to our childhood disagreements. This isn't just about credit, Olivia. It's about the company narrative Dad has spent years establishing with clients and the industry. If that narrative is suddenly contradicted by the regulatory audit, it could undermine client confidence in our leadership stability. The argument revealed the fundamental disconnect in our perspectives. James and my father viewed accurate attribution as a threat to a carefully constructed corporate narrative. I saw misattribution as a compromise of professional integrity and honest client relationships. Clients deserve to know who's actually driving the projects they're investing. Millions in, I said. The industry deserves accurate information about who developed methodologies they're adopting as best practices. And I deserve recognition for innovations I've created over 12 years of dedicated work. So, you're willing to damage the family business to get that recognition? He asked, a hint of accusation entering his tone. I'm not damaging anything by ensuring records accurately reflect reality, I countered. If acknowledging who actually developed our methodologies damages the company, then the problem lies in the fictional narrative that's been constructed, not in the truth that contradicts it. James was quiet for a moment, seemingly wrestling with competing loyalties. What are you planning to do? He asked finally. I'm meeting with Roger Anderson for lunch to discuss the technical requirements for the tower renovation, I replied. I'm continuing to oversee critical project decisions that can't wait for resolution of family disagreements. And I'm preparing comprehensive documentation for the regulatory audit that accurately reflects the development history of our compliance framework. And if Dad moves forward with the reorganization that places you under my direct supervision for all technical development? He pressed. It was the question I had been considering since our initial confrontation, the point at which professional ethics might necessitate separation from the family business. My independent business plan was now complete, my financial position secure enough to weather a transition, and my industry reputation strong among those who worked directly with our projects rather than attending networking galas. I'll make that decision when the reorganization is officially announced, I said, but I won't participate in deliberately misrepresenting my professional work to regulatory authorities or clients, regardless of my position within Chambers Construction. James stood, his expression troubled. I don't want it to come to that. Liv. Despite what you might think, I've never intentionally taken credit for your innovations. I've simply fulfilled the role Dad established for me as the public face of the company. Accepting credit you know belongs to someone else, even passively, is still misrepresentation, I replied. And after 12 years, it's created a fiction that bears little resemblance to how this company actually functions. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I've always known you're the real technical genius in the family. I couldn't explain half the methodologies I've presented to clients if my life depended on it. The admission was both validating and frustrating. Acknowledgement of the truth he had never publicly expressed, despite benefiting from its concealment for over a decade. Then why continue the charade? I asked. Why not tell Dad that our respective roles should align with our actual expertise rather than his predetermined hierarchy? James shrugged, a gesture that encompassed years of unspoken family dynamics. You know, Dad. Once he establishes a narrative, contradicting it becomes almost impossible. Besides, the arrangement worked. The company has thrived, clients are satisfied, and we've both advanced professionally. It worked for you, I corrected. It worked for Dad's vision of the company structure. It didn't work for accurate representation of who developed what, for my professional recognition, or for honest attribution of the innovations that have defined our success. He had no response to this fundamental truth, merely nodding slightly before departing. The conversation had revealed both the entrenched nature of the family dynamics and the limited awareness James had maintained about how those dynamics affected my professional identity and recognition. I returned to project oversight until my lunch meeting with Roger Anderson, addressing technical questions from implementation teams and reviewing specification modifications for ongoing renovations. Throughout these interactions, I was acutely conscious of the disparity between my actual role in the company's operations and the diminished position my father planned to formalize in the afternoon's reorganization announcement. My lunch with Roger Anderson proved illuminating in unexpected ways. We met at a waterfront restaurant equidistant from our respective offices, and he wasted no time addressing the rumors circulating through industry channels. I'll be direct, Olivia, he said as we settled at a table overlooking the harbor. I've heard Chambers Construction is undergoing some leadership restructuring, potentially affecting the technical expertise team. Before committing the Anderson Tower renovation to your company, I need clarity about who will actually be overseeing the preservation-compliant retrofitting approach. His forthrightness was refreshing after days of navigating family doublespeak and corporate fictions. The company is considering organizational adjustments, I acknowledged, but I can assure you that the technical methodology for historic structural reinforcement remains exactly as we discussed during the Cambridge consultation. Anderson leaned forward, his expression serious. With respect, Olivia, it's not the methodology I'm concerned about. It's who will be implementing it. I've worked with enough construction firms to recognize when genuine expertise is being sidelined for political reasons. The approach you developed for integrating modern systems into historic structures while maintaining preservation compliance is precisely why Anderson Development is considering Chambers Construction. If you're not going to be directly involved in our project, that significantly impacts our decision-making. His explicit acknowledgement of my role in developing the methodologies that had attracted his interest confirmed what I had long suspected. Industry insiders recognized where the technical expertise actually resided, regardless of who represented the company at networking events or award ceremonies. I appreciate your candor, I replied. The truth is that my position within Chambers Construction is currently evolving. Family businesses often navigate complex dynamics between organizational structure and functional expertise. Anderson nodded knowingly. I'm familiar with family business complications. My father and uncle nearly destroyed Anderson Development with similar dynamics before we implemented a structure that aligned authority with actual expertise rather than family hierarchy. This glimpse of another family business that had successfully navigated similar challenges offered perspective I hadn't previously considered. Perhaps the current conflict wasn't merely a choice between accepting continued misattribution or leaving the company, but an opportunity to advocate for structural reform that better served both family relationships and business functionality. How did you manage that transition? I asked, genuinely curious about alternatives to my current either-or thinking. Painfully, he admitted with a wry smile. It required brutal honesty about who contributed what to the company's success, followed by reorganization that placed people in positions matching their genuine capabilities rather than family expectations. My father remained chairman, providing strategic guidance without micromanaging operations. My uncle moved from executive leadership to client development, where his relationship skills were assets rather than limitations. And I shifted from marketing to project development, where my technical background was most valuable. The parallel to our family situation was striking, though I questioned whether my father possessed the flexibility to implement similar realignment. His vision of the company's structure seemed inextricably linked to James as his successor, regardless of our respective capabilities. The challenge, I observed, is when the established narrative about who contributes what has diverged significantly from reality over many years. Correcting that narrative requires acknowledging that previous attributions were inaccurate, something many family patriarchs find difficult to accept. Anderson nodded in understanding. Pride is the enemy of necessary adaptation in family businesses. My father initially saw structural changes as admissions of poor judgment rather than evolutionary improvements. What finally convinced him was a simple question from our consultant. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be successful? As our lunch continued, the conversation shifted to specific technical requirements for the Anderson Tower renovation. I outlined my approach to structural reinforcement that would preserve the building's historic character, while ensuring modern safety standards and sustainability goals. Throughout our discussion, Anderson directed technical questions exclusively to me, making clear his understanding of where the relevant expertise resided regardless of official company titles. When we parted after nearly 2 hours of productive conversation, he made his position explicit. Olivia, I'll be direct. The Anderson Tower contract will go to whatever firm you're working with when we break ground. Your expertise in preservation compliant modernization is what we need for this project, whether that's with Chambers Construction or elsewhere. His statement crystallized something I had been gradually recognizing throughout the family conflict. My professional value existed independently of the Chambers construction structure and narrative. The innovations I had developed, the methodologies I had implemented, and the expertise I had cultivated represented transferable assets that didn't depend on my father's company or approval for validation. As I returned to the office for the scheduled reorganization announcement, I felt a surprising sense of clarity and calm. Whatever my father announced, whatever position he assigned me within his revised corporate hierarchy, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. I had developed the innovations that defined Chambers Construction's success, and that truth would emerge through the regulatory audit, regardless of organizational charts or official narratives. More importantly, industry partners like Roger Anderson recognized where the genuine expertise resided, creating professional possibilities beyond the constraints of family expectations and predetermined hierarchies. For the first time since the conflict began, I saw the situation not merely as a painful choice between accepting misattribution or leaving the family business, but as an opportunity to advocate for structural alignment between actual contributions and formal recognition, or to establish an independent professional identity based on my demonstrated expertise rather than family connections. As executives and department heads gathered in the main conference room for my father's announcement, I noticed the subtle division forming among staff. Technical specialists and project managers, those who worked directly with me on implementation challenges, clustered together, expressions concerned but resolute. Administrative staff and those reporting primarily to James or my father occupied the opposite side of the room, their demeanor suggesting prior knowledge of the coming reorganization. The ripple effects of our family conflict had spread throughout the company culture, creating divisions that reflected the underlying tension between actual expertise and attributed authority. Whatever my father announced in the next few minutes would either begin healing that division through honest realignment of responsibilities or deepen it through further institutionalization of convenient fictions. Either way, the company records would soon be made public through the regulatory audit, revealing the truth that had been obscured by years of family narrative. And in that revelation lay both vindication for my unacknowledged contributions and the foundation for authentic professional identity moving forward, whether within a restructured Chambers construction or in an independent venture built on my established expertise. As my father approached the podium, I took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever came next with the same clarity and conviction that had guided my approach to complex renovation challenges throughout my career. Identify the fundamental, structural issues, develop solutions that integrate integrity with functionality, and implement changes that create sustainable balance between historical foundations and future needs. My father's reorganization announcement played out exactly as James had described. A transparent attempt to institutionalize the fiction of James as innovation leader, while relegating me to an implementation role. The newly created position of Chief Innovation Officer would oversee all technical development, with James as its inaugural holder. My redefined role as Operations Implementation Director would report directly to him, effectively demoting me while maintaining the appearance of executive status. Throughout the carefully crafted presentation about aligning organizational structure with strategic priorities and optimizing leadership resources for continued growth, I maintained my professional composure. The gathered staff listened, with expressions ranging from confusion to concern, particularly among the technical specialists and project managers who worked with me daily and understood the disconnect between this new structure and operational reality. When my father concluded his announcement and asked for questions, the room remained awkwardly silent. The staff recognized the family dynamics underlying these changes and wisely chose not to insert themselves into what was clearly a power struggle beyond their influence. "The restructuring takes effect immediately," my father declared, interpreting the silence as acceptance. "James will be scheduling individual meetings with department heads to discuss implementation details. Thank you, all, for your continued dedication to Chambers construction." As the room began to clear, Thomas Wilson, our CFO, approached me with an expression of carefully controlled concern. "Olivia, do you have a few minutes to discuss how this affects the Westfield project budget approvals? We have several pending material modifications that need executive authorization." His request was both legitimate business and a subtle expression of support, acknowledging my continued authority over technical decisions regardless of organizational charts. "Of course," I replied. "Let's review those in my office." As we walked together through the hallway, Thomas spoke quietly. "For what it's worth, everyone who works directly with projects knows who actually drives our technical innovations. This restructuring doesn't change that reality." His statement confirmed what I had observed during the announcement, the division forming between those who understood the company's operational reality and those who accepted the official narrative. The reorganization had merely formalized the fiction rather than addressing the underlying disconnect between contribution and credit. Back in my office, I found several messages awaiting my attention. Roger Anderson had emailed a formal request for a technical consultation regarding the tower renovation, specifically addressed to me rather than Chambers construction generally. Marcus Harrington had confirmed our Tuesday meeting for the regulatory audit documentation review, and Megan had texted a characteristically direct inquiry. "Heard about Dad's reorganization scheme? Still playing along or finally taking a stand?" I responded to the business inquiries first, confirming the consultation with Anderson and acknowledging Harrington's meeting confirmation. Megan's question required more reflection than I could immediately provide amid the professional demands that continued regardless of family dynamics. The remainder of the afternoon was consumed with project oversight and technical decisions that couldn't wait for organizational clarity. I approved material modifications for the Cambridge renovation, reviewed structural reinforcement specifications for the Westfield Library, and addressed permitting complications for our Providence warehouse conversion. Through each interaction, I maintained professional focus and decisive leadership despite my technically diminished position within the company hierarchy. By 6:30 p.m., the office had largely emptied, with only a few dedicated project managers remaining to address time-sensitive issues. I found myself alone in my executive suite, contemplating the practical implications of the reorganization while preparing documentation for Tuesday's regulatory audit. A knock at my door interrupted these reflections. James stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of discomfort and determination. "Can we talk about implementation details for the new structure?" he asked. I gestured to the visitor chair, closing my laptop to signal willingness for direct conversation, despite the professional awkwardness created by his official elevation above me in the corporate hierarchy. "I want to be clear that nothing really changes in how we operate day to day," he began, settling into the chair. "You'll continue managing technical implementation and project oversight exactly as you have been. The restructuring is primarily about how we present our leadership to clients and industry partners. So we're formalizing the fiction rather than addressing the disconnect between presentation and reality," I observed, creating an organizational chart that institutionalizes the misattribution of expertise rather than aligning authority with actual capabilities. James sighed, visibly uncomfortable with my directness. "I understand why you're frustrated, Liv, but Dad believes this structure best serves the company's interests and maintains the leadership continuity clients expect." "And what about the regulatory audit?" I asked. "Is the plan to present this retroactive restructuring as if it's been our operational reality throughout the development of the methodologies being evaluated?" He shifted in his chair. "Patricia has prepared contextual documentation explaining the company's historical functional structure, positioning technical innovations within the framework of executive direction. Even when project records clearly show I developed these approaches independently, often before they were ever presented to you or the executive team," I pressed. "The audit will examine materials within the context of our organizational hierarchy," he replied, avoiding direct engagement with the factual contradiction. "Patricia believes we can present a coherent narrative that satisfies regulatory requirements, while maintaining our established leadership structure." The conversation was beginning to feel like a rehearsal of our previous discussions, with James attempting to find middle ground between acknowledging my contributions and preserving the family-approved narrative of his leadership. "Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."